November 15th, 2017 is a day like any other in the small town of Wilbur, Nebraska. However, the unfathomable is about to happen. 24-year-old Sydney Loofe is about to vanish.
People don't want to believe that it actually could happen in their town. And in this situation, it did.
A crime like this doesn't typically happen in a small town.
Investigators are quick to act, but the deeper they dig, the more bizarre the case becomes, until a horrifying truth is revealed, one that leaves a small town in shock and a family broken beyond repair. Wilbur, Nebraska, quintessential small town USA. With a population of about 1850, its claim to fame is being the official Czech capital of the United States, as per a decree signed in the 1980s by then-President Ronald Reagan.
A lot of people don't really know much about Wilbur other than the fact that we come here for Czech days.
The town still lives up to its heritage by hosting an annual Czech festival every August, celebrating its European roots. A mere 45 minutes from Wilbur, north on Highway 77, is the state's capital, Lincoln. Ripe with numerous museums, galleries, and the oldest university in the state.
Wilbur is a small town, but it's located on the outskirts of the state capital, Lincoln, Nebraska. So that means that while it itself is a small town, it's located very close to the culture and the attractions that are present in a capital city.
The city of approximately 290,000 inhabitants is where 24-year-old hardware store cashier Sydney Loofe calls home. Sydney hails from Neely, Nebraska, about 2.5 hours from Lincoln, where she grew up like most small-town children with a budding love for the outdoors. From sledding with her mother and younger sister to fishing with her father and older brother, Sydney thrives in staying active. However, her athletic lifestyle takes an unfortunate turn in her teenage years when she develops scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that can cause severe pain. After her diagnosis, Sydney reevaluates her passions and makes the choice to move to Lincoln, where she lives with her cat Mimsy and works as a cashier at the hardware store. A dedicated employee, she's instantly loved by coworkers and customers alike, and excels at her job.
Well, Sydney was a young adult, really trying to find her way in life. She, just kind of did things that 24, 25-year-olds did, still trying to figure out exactly what she was hoping to do and where she was hoping to go, but making a living and having fun and meeting new people while she was living here.
Not only does she care deeply for her work, but Sydney finds joy in helping others. She often goes out of her way for friends who find themselves in a bind. She opens her own home on more than one occasion to help people who simply need a fresh start. She constantly puts others ahead of herself. She's the kind of person who never gives a second thought about taking someone in during their time of need. Sydney, like most young adults with their entire lives ahead of them, is slowly figuring out her purpose. While she finds solace in giving to others and in her love of animals, she still wants something more. She longs for a companion, someone to share experiences with.
Sydney Loofe is 24 years old. She wants to meet new people, so she decides to use a dating app to meet other local singles.
Dating apps are essentially programs that people have that allow them to select people they're interested in. And if two people ultimately select each other, they would be connected through the app, at which point they'd be allowed to start messaging each other.
After several months on the app and a few unsuccessful dates, Sydney and another user match. And it isn't long until they have their first date on the night of November 14th, 2017.
Dating applications is a relatively new phenomenon, and people need to understand that there are inherent risks in using these methods.
The first date goes so well that the two plan on meeting up the following night, the night of Sydney's disappearance.
People need to be careful about where they meet somebody they've never encountered before, and Sydney's smart. She tells her friends that she's going out with somebody. She tells them where they're going, when they're going, what they're going to be doing, all to put herself in a safer position.
November 15th, 2017 starts out like any other day for Sydney Loofe. She works a shift at the hardware store during the day, then heads home to get ready for her second date with her dating app match. At 6:54 p.m., Sydney's phone buzzes. Her date has arrived to pick her up. Sydney grabs her purse and gives herself a nervous final glance. This is what she's been looking forward to. Excited, she heads outside. Little does Sydney know, the unthinkable is about to happen. No one can predict the unspeakable horrors that are about to befall this innocent young woman. She's supposed to come home later that evening, cuddle with her cat in bed, then wake up the next morning and do it all over again. Instead, her life and the lives of others who love her are forever changed when Sydney Loofe disappears. On November 16th, Sydney fails to show up for her shift, something that's extremely out of character. She's never missed a workday without calling in.
This is the kind of case you hear about on the news and think, this kind of thing doesn't happen here. It shouldn't happen here.
Friends and family begin contacting one another, all with worry in their hearts, but trying to tell themselves that Sydney may have misplaced her phone or slept in. But with no one able to reach Sydney, her parents make the drive from Neely to Lincoln 2 days after last contact. They rush to her apartment fearing for the worst, but hoping for the best. What they find inside confirms their deepest fears.
They opened up the door to get in her apartment, noticed her vehicle was still there, and noticed that the cat didn't have any food or water.
Now, Sydney loves this cat, and so they immediately know that something's wrong because she would never leave it alone without any sustenance.
She talked to her parents pretty often. They were pretty close. They hadn't heard from her. They called police almost immediately after that.
The immediate time after somebody is reported missing, it's very important. The police need to act quickly. Those first few hours are precious in terms of the investigation.
Investigators begin at Sydney's place of work. Could a clue into her whereabouts lie somewhere within its walls? After speaking with employees and customers, they hone in on one very important piece of evidence: CCTV footage.
Video surveillance footage is very important in helping to establish a timeline and even demonstrate a trail where the missing person may have gone. It can certainly assist in identifying whether or not any suspicious behavior or activities took place in and around where the missing person was. It could even help identify a suspect.
This footage, taken outside Sydney's place of work, is the last known video of her. Sydney Loofe grew up in small-town Nebraska and eventually moved to the state capital, Lincoln. November 15th, 2017 is supposed to have been a day like any other. She works a shift at the hardware store, then heads home to get ready for a date with someone she's met online. When she doesn't show up for her shift the next day and can't be reached by friends or family, her parents rush to her apartment. Sydney's nowhere to be found. Investigators begin at Sydney's place of work in Lincoln. They hone in on one very important piece of evidence: CCTV footage. This footage is the last known video of her. Sydney's friends are already on the case. They have several saved photos from Sydney's social media, including one from the night of her disappearance, and another from November 14th, which shows Sydney with her date, a 23-year-old woman named Audrey. The same woman she went out with again on November 15th, the night Sydney posted a photo of herself ready for the date. Her friends create a fake profile on the dating app and get matched with Audrey, quickly gain her trust, and obtain her phone number. Sydney's friends contact police on November 17th, 2 days after her second date with Audrey. For them, all signs seem to point to one outcome: a date gone wrong.
Online dating apps are really just a roll of the dice in terms of you don't know who that person is on the other side. They may be able to keep up a pretense for some time before their true identity is revealed, and that's the inherent danger.
After several attempts, police finally get a hold of Audrey. She confirms that she and Sydney went on 2 dates, the first on November 14th and the second on November 15th, but that she hasn't heard from Sydney since. During a second phone call with police the next day, on November 18th, Audrey claims that on the night of the 15th, she picked Sydney up from her apartment and that they drove around Lincoln and smoked marijuana. Then she dropped Sydney off at a friend's house. She claims they made plans to see each other again the following day, but hasn't heard from her since. Investigators look into Audrey's version of events, and while they don't remove her entirely as a suspect, they do begin to look into other scenarios of what could have happened to Sydney. Is it possible that Audrey is telling the truth? If so, what transpires after Sydney is dropped off at her friend's house? Could it be that the investigators have been looking in the wrong direction? As the clock ticks down, the days pass by without any news on Sydney. The closest to her begin to fear the worst.
The first 48 hours are often referred to as the most critical time in a missing person's case. Evidence only lasts so long in many instances, and often it can be degraded the longer it sits and nobody detects it. Video footage can be overwritten, whether accidentally or just over the passage of time, and people forget things. The longer they go without having to think about something, the less likely they are to remember those small details.
Police continue their investigation, exhausting every possible lead. With that persistence and the use of technology, they uncover a key piece of evidence: the last ping from Sydney's cell phone.
Ping is a piece of data, essentially, that is transmitted from a cell phone to the nearest cell phone tower where it is stored. Police have been using this information for quite some time in order to help narrow down a geographical area where that ping may have originated from.
This particular ping shows Sydney in Wilbur, Nebraska, the night of her disappearance, a small town with a population of 1850. It's the kind of place where everyone is on a first-name basis, a place where secrets are hard to keep. Back in Lincoln, police try to locate another ping, but with no luck. They come to the conclusion that her cell phone's either been turned off or destroyed. With a possible location uncovered, investigators are still at a loss. The days have turned into weeks, and Sydney is still missing. With only one person of interest who maintains their story and no other evidence, the outcome into finding Sydney is beginning to look grim.
There's nothing worse than not being able to find the answers for the family of a missing person. No investigator wants to allow their case to grow cold.
While Sydney's family struggles to come to terms with her horrendous reality, the whole state of Nebraska is on high alert for either Sydney herself or anyone who may have more information into her whereabouts. Friends create the Finding Sydney Loofe social media page as a way to help the investigation and to receive tips, while also spreading the word about Sydney. And as the investigation continues, Sydney's hometown of Neely bands together. At Sydney's former high school, about 250 people gather for a candlelight vigil with hope of Sydney's safe return. Sydney's family does not attend. They find it too difficult. Posters are spread all throughout the state. Billboards are erected. Sydney's family release photos of her tattoos, the most prominent being lyrics on her inner right arm, all with hope that this information may help to locate her.
Investigators essentially pull out all the stops. They put up pictures of Sydney everywhere. Nobody in Nebraska could turn their head without seeing a picture of Sydney. This keeps her top of mind, and they also are aware that they need to keep looking for her.
As other families enjoy each other's company during the holiday season, Sydney's family and friends can only wonder where she could be. Police are tight-lipped with any new leads or evidence that may have been uncovered, which leads the Loofe family to draw their own conclusions. The Loofe family believes Sydney has been abducted. If this theory proves to be true, who could have taken Sydney? And what could their intentions be? It's been weeks since anyone has heard from 24-year-old Sydney Loofe. The last thing anyone hears from her is that she's about to get picked up from her apartment in Lincoln, Nebraska for a second date with Audrey, someone she met on a popular dating app. Audrey claims that after their date on November 15th, she drops Sydney off at her friend's house. Her parents go to her apartment. There, they find a cat without food and water, and that's when they know something horrible has happened. After discovering Sydney's latest cell phone ping in the small town of Wilbur, police have a theory regarding her whereabouts, but are keeping it to themselves, leaving Sydney's family to draw their own conclusions. They believe Sydney may have been abducted.
Kidnapping in the United States is pretty rare, but it does happen. Human trafficking these days is generally the reason kidnappings occur, whether it's to lock somebody into the sex trade, for example, or forced labor market.
With no concrete evidence and no sightings, the family can only hope that Sydney is okay. But police have a suspect, one who's been in front of everyone's noses all along. In the days following her disappearance, Sydney's friends create a fake profile on the dating app and find Audrey, Sydney's date. They quickly befriend her, convincing her to give them her phone number. She does, and Sydney's friends give that number to the police. Investigators are able to reach Audrey and speak to her. Audrey tells her side of the story. She and Sydney went on a date. Then she dropped her off at a friend's house and hasn't heard from her since. But investigators aren't 100% sold on Audrey's innocence. They keep the young woman as a person of interest. And it isn't long before their patience pays off. Authorities discover that Audrey isn't an Audrey at all. Her real name is Bailey Boswell, and she has more than a dozen federal fraud charges on her rap sheet, including an accusation that she defrauded 2 people out of more than $400,000. In total, she has more than 14 counts against her, and each of those comes with the possibility of up to 10 years in prison. Those charges, and the fact that she's the last person to see Sydney Loofe, are enough to bring her in for questioning. But the most damning bit of information authorities uncover is where Bailey lives. In a basement apartment 45 minutes south of Lincoln, in the small town of Wilbur, Nebraska. The same small town where Sydney's cell phone last pinged.
For the first night, they went out and smoked some weed, kind of got to know each other, and I believe that was that. The second night is when they ended up actually going back to the apartment in Wilbur, which is where everything happened after that.
Police execute a search warrant for Bailey's basement apartment in Wilbur, located only a block away from the community's public schools. Sydney's family and friends wait in pure terror and anticipation for news about the home in Wilbur. But they're heartbroken to hear that Sydney isn't there, and neither is Bailey. Police also take notice that the apartment has been thoroughly cleaned. The smell of bleach overpowers the small space. They log several items of interest as well, including Viagra and 17 sex toys. With Bailey Boswell nowhere to be found and an apartment that's been cleaned down to the bones, investigators now believe the worst has materialized. They believe Sydney Loofe has been murdered. Their only hope in finding the answers now rests with locating Bailey Boswell. But Nebraska is the 16th largest state in the country, with a combined population of nearly 2 million people. Bailey Boswell could be anywhere. She could have even left the state.
Surveillance video footage can be like following a trail. One piece of footage leads to another. In the case of Bailey Boswell, when police start following her trail, they realize she hasn't covered her tracks well enough.
When the media get wind of Bailey's possible involvement, she releases a video on social media proclaiming her innocence.
I met her on a Tuesday. We drove around Lincoln, smoked weed, had a great time. We hit it off. I dropped her off at home, picked her up the next night at her house. We made our way to my house where we smoked. I went to take her home, and she asked me to drop her off at a friend's house, so I did so. I mean, I haven't heard from her since. I didn't have anything to do with this, and I hope that Sydney is found very soon. She is a sweet, amazing girl.
Little does Bailey know, she's left a trail. The police use the closed-circuit TV footage from various shops and stores to follow her as she tries to evade authorities. On November 30th, 2017, 15 days after Sydney's disappearance, Bailey is apprehended in Branson, Missouri, nearly 6 hours south of Wilbur. Yet as police take her into custody, and as they further review the surveillance footage of the many hotels and stores where Bailey has been caught on camera, they make a shocking discovery. In all of the footage, Bailey isn't alone. But it isn't Sydney by her side. It's an older man, 51-year-old Aubrey Trail.
Bailey had come from kind of a broken home and was looking for somebody to kind of take her under their wing, and her and Aubrey started dating. They started, doing drugs together. They also started, stealing these antiques and kind of getting a good thing going for them. Aubrey always said he had money, and Bailey was right there with him.
But Aubrey is painting a completely different picture than the ones authorities are.
We spent the last few days watching ourselves being slammed and crucified in the newspapers, and we thought it was time we had our say. The police department apparently wants everyone to believe that we're hiding, that we haven't talked to them, that we're avoiding them. We both wrote long statements telling them everything we know. We repeatedly called the Lincoln Police Department. We were told to quit blowing up their phone, even though we told them, hey, do you understand that we're the people you're looking for? They're telling you that they have all these leads, that Sydney was last seen in Wilbur. What they're not telling you is that we are the two people who gave them all these leads.
Police find and arrest Aubrey Trail. Yet even with the two main suspects in custody, the question on everyone's mind remains: where is Sydney Loofe? And how is Aubrey Trail involved in all of this?
Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell, you're in more or less what even Aubrey Trail would call a criminal racket. They kind of just moved around the Midwest area, buying and selling antiques. Most of them were stolen. Aubrey Trail admits that. And then they would sell them, and that's how they got money. Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell also invited young girls who may not have had a direction in life, or maybe looking for a family, or had a broken family of their own, invited them into their family. He would give them money, and more or less they would become a family, where then they would engage in sexual encounters with each other, and he would pay them and tell them that they were one of his girls. And they bounced around the Midwest a lot, mostly keeping their home base for the time period in Wilbur, but they had lived around in other places throughout the Midwest.
Authorities may have suspects, but they still don't know what happened to Sydney or where she is. But that all changes on December 4th, 2017, when Sydney Loofe's remains are found scattered about an hour west of Wilbur, near the rural town of Edgar, Nebraska. Along the empty country roads, investigators discover her dismembered body. Her assailants cut her body into 14 pieces and placed them into garbage bags.
They found multiple trash bags with body parts in all kinds of different areas, just cut up in various ways throughout all these trash bags.
Of the 14 bags, only 13 are recovered.
The forensic pathologist examines the female remains and is able to identify them as Sydney. Identification is based on the lyrical tattoo that was located on her right arm. They also determined that Sydney's cause of death was from asphyxiation, as there were signs of petechial hemorrhaging. From this, it is concluded that somebody strangled Sydney to death before dismembering her body.
But you would think by dismembering an entire person's body inside of a small apartment, there would be some sort of evidence, whether it be blood spatter, hair, any sort of DNA that was left there. But there was nothing that investigators found.
Only a true psychopath has the ability to do what was done to Sydney. A psychopath is typically somebody who is incapable of showing remorse for their actions. They may or may not have had interactions with the police in the past, and they're masters of manipulation.
Though the outcome is not what everyone's hoping for, with 2 suspects in custody and enough evidence to convict them, a light shines through the darkness, and the trials can begin. Missing Sydney Loofe is discovered to have met a horrific end. Police have her last known contacts, Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail, in custody and have brought them to trial.
I didn't have anything to do with this, and I hope that Sydney is found very soon. She is a sweet, amazing girl.
Family and friends wait with bated breath to find out what really happened to Sydney. Court gets underway for Aubrey Trail in 2018, who briefly maintains his innocence before making the first of many startling confessions. In February of that year, he admits to causing Sydney's death, but claims it's an accident.
The court has to consider all the evidence that's presented to the court. So if Aubrey says that it's an accident, that's definitely something that the court has to weigh whether or not they think that that's what likely occurred. If it is determined by the court that it was an accident, it could certainly lead to a lesser charge, manslaughter, a criminal negligence, or something that has to do with tampering with a body after death.
But what about Aubrey's declaration of innocence? The court has to take that into consideration as well.
As far as I know, I'm not wanted for anything. I'm a person of interest, and I'm not really running from anything.
As the witnesses are called to the stand, the curtain hanging over that night is slowly pulled back, and the truth of it is more horrifying than anyone can imagine. Sydney has been in contact with Bailey using the alias of Audrey.
Bailey and Sydney met on social media November of 2017, more or less just looking to go out on a date.
On November 14th, the 2 women have their first date.
They were gonna maybe go out and smoke some weed, kind of get to know each other.
Things go well enough for them to agree to a second date the following night.
Bailey had brought Sydney back to the apartment.
What Sydney couldn't know is that Bailey Boswell has been luring women back to the apartment in Wilbur that she shares with Aubrey Trail. Aubrey claims to have paid Sydney $5,000 to fulfill a sexual fantasy of his that involves strangulation. He says she's a willing participant and that she's even excited to partake, but that the evening goes too far, and he ends up accidentally strangling her. In a state of panic, Aubrey makes the choice to dismember Sydney.
Somehow he dismembers the body, drains all the blood, and it's all cleaned up so there's no evidence of her blood even being in the apartment.
Aubrey divides her remains into 14 garbage bags, then drives around the Nebraskan countryside.
They start driving west of Wilbur, And first off, they're throwing out some of her belongings out the window, her cell phone, which is later recovered along a highway west of Wilbur. Then they go even farther west of Wilbur and dispose of her body just in some brush off the side of the highways. For the longest time, Aubrey, one of his many stories, said that he never planned to kill Sydney, that she had a medical seizure while they were engaging in sexual acts. He just happened to feel like the best way to get her out of the apartment after she died was to cut her up because he couldn't carry her over his shoulder out the apartment and somebody would see her. So he said that this was a spur-of-the-moment thing.
However, it becomes clear rather quickly that Sydney's murder is not a spur-of-the-moment thing. It's premeditated, and prosecutors have the evidence to back up their claims.
In Nebraska, first-degree murder can either be designated as a Class 1 or a Class 1A felony, and that depends on the aggravating or mitigating circumstances of the offense.
Closed-circuit TV footage shows Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail out and about the morning of November 15th.
They showed him going to buy drop cloths, going to buy hacksaws, going to buy tin snips, and even meat grinders at places hours or days before Sydney was murdered. They also had video of Bailey buying more drop cloths and things that were actually being used to kill or to cover up the murder. That really showed that this was premeditated. Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail had gone there to buy things to more or less cover up a crime or to dismember a body.
The landlord testifies that she smells an overpowering stench of bleach the day after Sydney's disappearance.
During the autopsy, the forensic pathologists spot markings on Sydney's bones that are consistent with the hacksaw, the same hacksaw that the perpetrator purchased. Her remains also show a sign of a struggle, which indicated that she attempted to fight back.
The footage clearly shows the two suspects purchasing these items, but the most chilling footage of them all is when Aubrey Trail walks through the door of Sydney Loofe's work, just as she exits. She doesn't appear to notice him, but he notices her.
There were two big takeaways from the surveillance video that were played at the trials. One was showing the fact that Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell had been following Sydney Loofe at her place of work. This was after Bailey and Sydney had gone on their first dates. Aubrey was aware of her. We do not think that Sydney was aware of who Aubrey was. So as he's walking in, she can be seen kind of walking out, and he's turning around, more or less stalking her, kind of checking her out, just to get a good glimpse of her to figure out if she might be good for their family, so to speak.
So in this case, they're also charged with conspiracy to commit murder as well as improper disposal of human remains. So those certainly are aggravating circumstances, and if it's designated as a Class 1 felony, that could potentially lead to the death penalty, whereas a Class 1A penalty would be more likely to result in a sentence of life imprisonment.
After months of proceedings, Aubrey Trail continues to cling to the story that Sydney's murder is an accident, and adds that Bailey Boswell has nothing to do with it. But the evidence doesn't lie, and it's not in either of their favors. So, in a last-ditch attempt to shift the blame to himself, Aubrey sneaks a razor blade into the courtroom, declares Bailey's innocence once more.
Bailey is innocent and I curse you all. Oh, Jesus!
Then slashes at his own throat. Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail are convicted of the murder of Sydney Loofe. And after slashing his throat in court while trying to clear Bailey's name, the trial continues on without Aubrey. And as for the claim that Bailey has nothing to do with Sydney's murder,
I gave her my number. I haven't heard from her since.
What actually happened in that apartment, we don't really know. But to say that Bailey Boswell had no part in it, I think is completely false.
I really don't even know what else to say. I didn't have anything to do with this, and I hope that Sydney is found very soon. She is a sweet, amazing girl.
She had as much of a part in disposing of the body as Aubrey Trail did. She can't sit there and say that she was just an innocent party when she allowed this to happen. She didn't cover her ears and eyes for days and days. Starting with luring Sydney to dismembering the body, disposing of the body, and then ultimately being on the run for days after that.
With Aubrey's trial wrapped and his verdict to come, Bailey's trial begins. As more witnesses take the stand, the events portrayed in Aubrey's trial take a twisted and unexpected turn in Bailey's, painting an even clearer picture of their lifestyle and claiming that the two accused have a mutual goal in mind: to take an innocent life. Bailey Boswell uses a popular dating app as a means to lure women to Aubrey Trail and into their self-proclaimed cult. Witnesses claim that Aubrey calls himself the Daddy Vampire and that the women he and Bailey bait are his witches.
Bailey talked to a lot of the girls in their so-called family about killing and did talk to them about how she was almost excited about killing, and even would talk about one of their girls killing another one of their girls.
Aubrey allegedly believes that by taking a life, the cult will be granted magical powers. And the innocent life they choose to take to fulfill their sick fantasy is none other than Sydney Loofe.
I think Aubrey and Bailey did love that lifestyle and were never wanting to give that up. They loved the free life sexually, to experiment with others and to have all kinds of sexual encounters. Ultimately, that's why Aubrey said he killed Sydney Loofe.
In 2019, Aubrey Trail is found guilty of criminal conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. 2 years later, on June 9th, 2021, a 3-judge panel sentences Aubrey Trail to death for the killing of Sydney Loofe.
Murder in the first degree, a Class 1 felony. The defendant is sentenced to death,
making him inmate number 12 on death row in Nebraska. On October 14th, 2020, it takes the jury only 3.5 hours to reach Bailey Boswell's verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, and guilty of improper disposal of human remains. The 3-judge panel examines the case again on November 8th, 2021. Unlike Aubrey Trail, Bailey Boswell avoids the death penalty and is sentenced to life in prison. "24-year-old Sydney Loofe had her whole life in front of her. She cared for others more than she cared for herself. She loved animals, her family, and her job as a cashier. Her memory lives on in the communities of Nebraska that she called home.
I would say Wilbur is different somewhat now because people know this stuff can happen in your town. It's not just a big city, and something this horrific did happen right there, and they had to drive by those areas every day.
Several benches around the state are named in her honor, all to ensure that Sydney Loofe and her vibrant, giving spirit will never be forgotten.